part of the series of public lectures and discussions organized by Science Gallery Bengaluru for its first digital pop-up exhibition, Phytopia. For Phytopia, we hope to bring together engineers, scientists, designers, artists, and biohackers to create an experience where visitors can explore and experiment beyond the kitchen, the lab, and the farm. This program is organized in collaboration with Bangalore International Center. A warm welcome to today's speakers, Dornith Doherty and Giovannai Aloi. Dornith Doherty is an American artist working primarily with photography, video, and scientific imaging. She currently resides in South Lake and is Distinguished Research Professor at the University of North Texas. Her work Archiving Eden is being shown at Science Gallery Bengaluru as a part of Phytopia. You can know more about this project in the exhibition section of our website. Giovannai Aloi is an author, curator who teaches modern and contemporary art at the School of Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby's Institute of Art. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of Antenna, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. Science Gallery Bengaluru is featuring 2 issues of Antenna. You can find Beyond Morphology and Why Look at Plants on our website along with other reading material. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to remind our audience that Dornith will be present for a Q&A session after this conversation at 7:30 p.m. You may post your questions in the chat box and we will pass them on to the speakers. New research in science shows us that plants are collaborative, sentient, and communicative beings. It displaces the anthropocentric position of plants as stationary and mute organisms. Dornith, it would be great if you could begin by giving us some background about your work in documenting seed banks around the world and the massive efforts undertaken by biologists and conservation agencies to protect biodiversity.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to everybody at the Science Gallery for inviting me to present this talk, but also participate in the exhibition. It's a really important point of view on plants and plant life, and I think that it's going to be really fun to see all the other artists that are involved. And thanks very much also to Giovannai for agreeing to participate in a conversation. I've been reading his book, Why Look at Plants, and I've really enjoyed it. And I think that there's a lot of things for us to talk about between my project and his extensive publication record with a 10A, which I think is a wonderful journal. Here you go. So in 2008, I read about the pending completion of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, located on an island only 600 miles from the North Pole. This remote and secure seed bank is buried deep inside a mountain so tall that if both polar ice caps melt, the collection of seeds will remain safe. So when I read that a modern day Noah's Ark had been built there, I immediately wanted to photograph it. I was inspired by the kind of simultaneously optimistic and pessimistic aspects of building the first truly global botanical backup collection. You know, on one hand, you have volunteers and scientists who have dedicated themselves to creating this very important archive. And on the other side, the gravity of climate change and political instability has created this need for a really remote and secure, almost doomsday vault. So I didn't start with Svalbard. I started at local seed banks and worked for a couple of years before I was invited to go and photograph inside the Svalbard vault. It's not, most seed banks are not open to the public, so it's very hard to gain access to them. And in my case, Svalbard's only open for 2 days a year when they bring in new seeds. And then the rest of the time, it really serves as like a safety deposit box. It's completely closed. So you can imagine how powerful this experience is where you walk into this cavern that is filled with boxes of living seeds that are in a state of suspended animation, preserved for a distant and unknowable future. And one of the things that doesn't come across when you look at the documentary photographs is the sound and the physical experience of being in a seed bank, because it's awe-inspiring. You really get this sense that you're in the Arctic. You know, I was wearing every single piece of clothing I owned. It was bitterly cold. There was so much wind and so much noise. But then you're really like at one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And it was just this amazingly powerful experience. So in the 10 years I worked on this, and from my first moment of wanting to photograph this project, this topic, you know, it expanded into this very wide-ranging expeditionary project where I traveled to more than 20 seed banks over 5 continents, photographing this subject. And this is the Barley collection in the historic Valvolive Institute for Plant Industry in St. Petersburg, Russia. And it's a really important historic bank, primarily because it was the first comprehensive seed bank before Svalbard. And it had a very utopian impulse at first. It was founded by Nikolai Valvolive. I almost pointed at my screen, which no one else, of course, in the world could see that I was pointing at my screen. But you can see his portrait in the cabinet. And he was in the early part of the 20th century, made over 100 expeditions to collect plants, to create an archive of biodiversity so they could improve crops and prevent famine. Now, tragically, in World War II, St. Petersburg, where this is located, was under siege by the Nazis for 28 months. And over 600,000 citizens died of St. Petersburg, died of starvation, and including the scientists at the seed bank. And what they had done is, in World War II, they had evacuated the Hermitage, all the paintings and the works of art from there, and but they did not evacuate the seed bank. And I'm sure most of the people watching this know that biodiversity is a unique thing, and that once you lose a particular strain, you can't go back and get it. It may not be in the field anymore. It may be extinct in the wild. And so the scientists, knowing that, they barricaded themselves in and died of starvation rather than eat the seeds under their care. Most seed banks, as you know, I now know a lot about seed banking from my travels, and most seed banks have labs associated with them, national ones do, where they're trying to do research on the methodologies and technologies for extending the life of plants and seeds under their care. But they also have most of them also do crop improvements. And that's because seed banks can't save all biodiversity because they don't have unlimited resources. They have to make choices. And most of the time, even in the biggest banks, what is funded is directly related to humans. So it's usually plants that are seen as beneficial to humans or economically important plants. So it could be food or fuel or forage or even plastics. And this is acai, which they're developing, you know, looking for new food crops that are nutrient dense for an ever-growing population. This is a papaya collection also in Brazil. And what's interesting to me is that I just wanted to show that many plants don't grow from seed with the same characteristics as the parent plants. So in addition to seed banks, this is a crop improvement collection, but there's also live collections of plants that are used for seeds in the wild because they're used as clones. And you'll notice that there's little powder circles around these, and that's for its pesticide. but they're also collecting in Brazil complete ecosystems. So they're collecting nematodes and fungi, because I realized that the seeds themselves are part of a more extensive system that needs to also be preserved. So that's a new aspect of seed banking that's kind of expanding. So as I photographed this constant agonizing quest to preserve the spark of life in these really tiny vulnerable seeds, some of which are no bigger than this, like a tiny grain of sand. These are orchid seeds, which happen to be the smallest types of seeds in the world. But I really wanted to get at the bigger questions about life at radically different scales and what our relationship is with plants. So that led me to collaborate with biologists at the seed banks to create a different kind of imagery. So Archiving Eden has two parts. There is the documentary images of seed banks from around the world that we've been looking at, but also these collages that I make from X-rays of the plants in the collection. So this is called epiphyte, and it's made from orchid brackets in a seed bank in Australia. I was privileged enough to be able to go to 3 seed banks in Australia. And for me, they're more open-ended, they're metaphoric, they have the visual acuity and sharpness of detail that the documentary work does, but they have a more open-ended meaning. And so there's a slippage for me between this kind of descriptive quality of looking at a really finely detailed X-ray of wild seedlings, but also there's a metaphoric quality that speaks to reproductive power or other issues that I've encountered as the questions that rise while I go to the seed banks. And for me, using the X-rays as a way of doing this, for me, has kind of multiple layers of why I might do that. And one is that they use it's scientific imaging that they're looking at for statistical analysis of seeds. So they are looking at seeds, and I've repurposed it with the help of the scientists and the permission of the scientists to look at their research seedlings or seed collections that are used for research purposes because the X-rays damage it. And for me, it's like the notion of looking inside the plants themselves. It's almost like the process of going into a seed bank, and it allows you to see what you can't see with human vision and ask those bigger questions about the spark of life for me. And these are sweet potato clones, which are, a lot of our food supply are grown from clones now. So, one of the things that I encountered time and time again was the exchange of knowledge and plants that happened between the various seed banks and the scientists. So you would go into a seed bank that would have corn literally everywhere in, the world they all have a collection of corn. And that's because crops like corn or barley are great crops for humans, and they're nutrient rich and can be grown in a variety of situations. And so that notion of this giant exchange of information and plants brought me back to the Columbian exchange, of course, where you have East meets West, and the kind of explosion and exchange of knowledge, but also disease agents, right? So in this case, this is dry land flora. These are specimens from the Australian and the US banks that are being grown in a hyper-arid desert location. And so I took samples of the plants that they're growing there. So there are plants that are globally, from everywhere, but they're brought to this one spot where it rains less than an inch a year for research into how to improve crops. Since with climate change, they think that we're going to have a lot of problems with deserts. So that notion of the Columbian exchange and the tie into the historical trade of that I find super interesting. And in some ways, I think of myself as being part of that, right? That I'm being passed around by the seed banks. The way that I gain access is that I get in one of the scientists will tell me a story about a seed bank and say, you should really go to this seed bank because they're doing this really interesting research. And then I show up and they share the knowledge, and then I kind of go to the next place. But, and now that we're battling COVID, it's very interesting the pessimistic part of removing plants or agents and then transporting them accidentally or on purpose, how that might unleash a whole series of unintended consequences. So speaking of unintended consequences, this is a piece I did for a biennial in Liverpool, and it's called Then and Now, Potato Diversity in the Irish Diaspora. And of course, with a name like Dornith Doherty, you can probably guess that my family came over with was made to migrate because of the potato famine in Ireland. And so these are actually a collection of blight-resistant potato plants now. And, one of the many, it's a complex cultural and political situation in Ireland that led to this famine. But part of it is that potatoes have a lack of biodiversity. And so when the blight hit, there was no resistance built into the crop. And so when the blight hit, it was all a monoculture and and it was wiped out very quickly, causing widespread famine. And 30% of the population either died or had to leave Ireland, or decided to leave Ireland, I should say. And then and so here we have corn, which is again a great crop, but the system behind it, because it's such an important crop, you can see that the political aspects of trying to grow a lot of it or modifying it over years. It started out as teosinte, which is a very tiny grain, and in Mexico and Central America, it was modified through crossbreeding to become the corn we know today. And it's now entered into our system in the US, where it's kind of a factory crop, where they're trying to produce as much as they can. And they find that having a lack of diversity, having it super monoculture, makes it easier for them to grow lots and lots of it, but of course places us at risk. And in this case, this is one of the things that's too bad about having a digital exhibition rather than a physical one is that I've been making these lenticular prints, and this animation just kind of hints at how beautiful they are when you see them in person. And what this does is, this is a kind of study of biodiverse corn. It's corn in which the husk grows around each kernel instead of the whole ear, so it's kind of like garlic. But it's also about how it's a still image that changes. So even though you have a plant that you're trying to put into a state of suspended animation, you can't really stop time. And of course, things continue to change. And so there's a series of works that when you see them in person are quite beautiful. They're lenticular prints, and they change colors as the viewers move by, from green to brown or blue to green, talking about the cryogenic process or the drying or the colors of corn. And I also use color in other ways. This one, of course, for me still relates to the notion of the Columbian Exchange and the East meets West. So it uses indigo blue, which could, and sometimes when I'm using that color, for me refers to the process of cryogenic preservation, which is so central to the process of, to the methodology of seed banking. But it also has this, refers to delft or indigo or delft, which of course talks about the delft blue, that, the way that the ceramic colors and the use of that kind of imagery went from China to Holland to the Dutch to Mexico, and has become this way of speaking in a shorthand term or a visual way about the Columbian exchange for me. And then this, you know, the other thing I should probably talk about is my relationship with the scientists, because they have made it possible in so many ways through their conversations and their collaborations to, you know, for me to make this project and open the door to their technological garden. So it's through conversations, as I mentioned before, that how I, you know, find out what they're doing and what they're thinking about. These are images made from the Millennium Seed Bank in England, and they refer in their organizational structure to the cabinets of curiosities and people like Alfred Wallace, who of course was a famous natural historian and evolutionary theorist. So if you're looking at these, it's their research, but also test garden. And they have from seeds to seedlings to seed heads, which of course are a type of seed banks themselves of all the different types of plants. And one of the reasons I have this one is to talk about the way that we systematize or categorize plants and think about it in organizational structures, but also to talk about the biodiversity of the Millennium Seed Bank itself, because they are trying to bank all of the plants that are possible to bank in England. And so they have gotten very close to collecting all of the possible plants that they can. Some plants don't store well, so they've had to make adjustments for that. And now, interestingly enough, they have moved to their formal colonies and are doing kind of a post-colonial collection where you see collections from the Commonwealth in the Millennium Seed Bank as well. As I mentioned, the seed heads themselves, this is red yucca, which is native to Texas, but they also have kind of a seed bank structure to themselves. So that connection between human systems that echo the natural systems, I think are really, really interesting. And some of the challenges that I've encountered as I've traveled, this is the Russian, this is not in St. Petersburg. This is a seed bank in Kuban, Russia, and it is soy. And one of the challenges I came up against again and again is that the biodiversity that I find in the seed banks is not really a reflection of the biodiversity of the home country, the national identity. It's really about the resources that they're able to devote to this effort. So I would go in, and this seed bank is super important and in terrible shape. It's not, you know, they don't have the resources to keep them cold enough or to maintain the collection. And once this biodiversity is gone, you know, you can't recapture it. So this is in Australia. It's an antique seed collection that they have that of course is not kept refrigerated. But, you know, my experience, so you have the very dark part of it, but then you also have this experience of going to these remote locations where you have individual scientists working on their own, sometimes in very small groups, to preserve biodiversity. And so that really gives me hope. This is another, like to kind of bring us back to Svalbard. When I was there in 2010 for those 2 days to photograph the collection, the white boxes are the US boxes, and the two little red boxes are from Uganda. And for me, I was really, that just kind of summed up the notion of resources and dedication. But it also, and I was very sad because, you know, Uganda is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, but because of political instability, they're not able to put forth the efforts that they might and to preserve the plants for the future. But, you know, and at first I was really, really sad. And then I saw I thought about it a different way, which was that two people or a couple of people found boxes and collected seeds and managed to send those seeds to Svalbard. And so those are safe. And, that it's that kind of dedication that gives you hope for the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dornith. It has been such an interesting sort of revelation about that there are so many different factors that go into such collaborative experiences and processes. And of course, you being an artist and trying to bring these sort of processes to light through the kind of documentation that you do, through the kind of images that you create is also very interesting. And Giovannai, I'd love to also know what you think about Dornith's process, considering that you yourself come from a background of art history and you also study natural history in visual culture. We would love to know what your thoughts are about Dornith's work.
Sure, thank you. Dornith, what a fantastic presentation. I wish it could have gone on for a lot longer. There's so much here to talk about. And one of the things that fascinates me about your work is specifically in relation to issues of visibility and invisibility, which is what I focused on throughout my research on animals and plants in art. Because of course, as you know, the history of science is made of visible and invisible entities, and the way in which we see these natural entities changes our conception of them incredibly. So what I find fascinating is that, we've been looking at plants. My book, Why Look at Plants, which repurposes the very famous, the title of the very famous essay by John Berger, Why Look at Animals, also contains that root of looking, seeing, and therefore conceptualizing. And I think there's something fascinating about looking at plants, the notion of plant blindness, and how plants have always been around us, but we've become blind to them. Or the opposite aspect, which is we look at plants only when they're gorgeous, exotic, eye-catching. And I think that seeds are the ultimate frontier of this visible-invisible paradigm, whereby they are the plant. They are like, if you like, the soul of the plant. And I shiver as I say this, but they're also near invisible in two ways. Sometimes, as you pointed out, they're so tiny that we need magnifying tools. We just won't be seeing much with the naked eye. But at times, they're also not particularly pleasing when we can see them as a grown plant. They're not quite as eye-catchy in a traditional sense. Macrophotography recently has showed us the architectural beauty of seeds. So I feel that your work explores this interesting interfaces in which visibility and invisibility play important roles in our understanding of plants as connected to everything, not just as objects, aesthetic objects. So there's a sense of freeing up plants from this burden, which is this kind of objectification. It's a beautiful living organism or a preserved organism. So the way in which you use photography, X-ray, and different processes, imaging processes, to render what is invisible or less visible, visible in an interesting way, really fascinates me. I don't know if you want to say something about that process, since you engage with it in so many different ways.
Well, thank you, Giovannai. What a nice thing to say. Well, there's so many threads of what you touched on right then to kind of tease out, and but the notion of making the visible invisible, the invisible visible, is really at the core for me. And interestingly enough, photography in some ways there's that William J. Mitchell essay about, I'm going to forget the title, but he talks about the notion of, like systems of making images to bring the far away closer. And, first that you send out somebody to get a physical archaeological record and they dig it up, and then there's the drawing of it. And then finally, we have photography bringing the moon, that we send people to the moon with cameras to bring back these images of inaccessible places or things that you wouldn't have access to. And, right now we're kind of participating in that right now with a Zoom meeting. You're in Chicago, I'm in Texas, they're in India. And that notion of bringing something that you couldn't see by yourself closer through the system of capturing light rays off something and then projecting it onto another surface, either a sensor or a piece of paper, is like one of my favorite things about photography. And that indexical relationship that is kind of going away, where you're standing in front of seeds in a seed bank in the Arctic and you're catching light rays off of it onto a light sensitive material. Because at the time I was using view cameras, so I had a 4x5 sheet of film. And that notion that you were somehow collecting emanations onto this piece of paper that becomes your own, that are invisible and yet they make a record, for me is just such a great part of photography. But then, to take it into the seeds, that, that notion of the invisibility of seeds, and when they're really of key importance, and, and that the notion that we could restart a whole ecosystem just by collecting these tiny seeds. Or, that in the US, they're trying to do, for mitigating wildfires, they're collecting native seeds in an attempt to, if there's a wildfire, be able to reestablish it. But that fundamental importance that we don't even think about, and now I see, I encounter seeds everywhere, right? From jewelry to, popcorn. And you don't even think about them. And so it's very interesting, that notion. And I'm working on a project right now about air and microscopic air pollution and the way that it travels around the world. And I'm using scanning electron microscope imagery. I'm making images of bird feathers that have collected the dust as they kind of swim through this atmospheric ocean of dust, as a way of rendering visual something. This is off topic, sorry about that, but like, that the atmosphere is invisible until it kind of coalesces into the haze of distance, right? Or if you have really bad pollution, you may see it. But that question of how do you render that visible, or an object that you can think about and raise questions? And for me, bringing it back to the seed bank, that's the interesting part for me, is that people, like, I didn't know what a seed bank was before I started the project or read that article. And then, but then it becomes a way of opening conversations about what is our relationship as stewards of the environment and of these living beings into the future, right? So that's my interest in it now, is that it's allowed me to have conversations that I, ask people to consider it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dornith. In fact, my next question that I jotted down notes about that I wanted to ask you is about the actual term bank. It's interesting how you also mentioned cabinets of curiosities. So I know that your work is concerned with the idea of collecting and the history of collecting, which is not necessarily connected to the history of banks.
Right.
And then the seed banks collapse different economic registers with historical practices. And I was wondering, especially in the light of your comment right now of stewardship, which is such a fraught word right now in the humanities in relation to nature. I was wondering what are your thoughts on the word bank in the context of seed banks?
I know, isn't that interesting, the way that it ties into economic systems?
Immediately.
Right, and then the way that it's so dependent on economic resources, and it's also seen as valuable. Yeah, it's so funny because it's so layered. But I wish I had an opportunity, and I wasn't thinking clearly, obviously, but I had this opportunity to photograph a 500-year-old citrus collection in Florence at a Medici palace, and that's in the project. And that one is so interesting, and in that very way, right? That, seed banks come out of agricultural practices, but they also come out of these huge natural history collections where people were collecting rare plants like tulips or citrus, and then making collections of those and organizing them. And, in some ways, those preserve them for the future as well. So yeah, it's super interesting.
And how do you feel about this notion of stewardship? There's something I find interesting about, it's incredible that the seed banks exist, and I think it's great that they exist, but I wonder, there's a utopianist quality and an apocalyptic quality to them, where I feel like the seed banks are the incarnation of this desperate attempt to preserve what we have been destroying, and attempt to somehow preserve what is preservable in the face of climate change, which, as we know, is moving plants around the globe. It's going to affect the living environments of these plants to a point that we will have to rethink where you can seed some of the seeds that are kept in these banks. So just the notion of stewardship and biodiversity, I'm just thinking about letting go, the two poles of philosophical concern in the sense of the conception of nature. Should we just let go and let it happen, or is this bank conception bringing us back to administration, management, rationalization, and nature as resource that then becomes the source of the very problem with nature itself?
Yes. Well, and when you, so I have a couple of thoughts about that. The notion that we have, reduced it to the point that, with climate change, for instance, they were doing all sorts of research of having salt resistant rice, or rice that can not drown if there is a flood, right? And all of that is because of the changes that we're seeing with climate change, that the seas will rise, and a lot of those coastal areas, which is where rice is oftentimes grown, will be one of the first affected, and it's a huge crop for worldwide, for life. So that notion of trying to manage this, key to feeding thousands and thousands of people through managing its biodiversity, and a race against time to kind of find all the strains of rice that have not been cultivated so they could possibly help for unforeseen problems in the future. That is so dystopian, right? That it's come to this. And then, but I can't help but think that, I encountered in Australia a plant that is only grown in one spot, and companies have to fund plant surveys before they disrupt the soil. And so they discovered this plant and were able to save it. But, who knows if it'll be able to regenerate in some other, surely it's a tiny little, but part of it for me is this hopeful part, is that, that you don't know what the future will bring. And so having this archive, right, gives me this tiny bit of hope. But of course, like people say to me, yeah, but if the worst comes to worst, there's total apocalypse, no one's going to remember the seed bank or have a key to the door or any of those things, right? And in Svalbard itself, they built it to last the ages, at least 200 years, and it's already had a flood from the permafrost melting, and it's 12 years old. So the best laid plans, right? That notion. But then somebody else asked me a question which I thought was amazing, is have we co-evolved with plants in a way that has made us their agent of transportation? This notion of them being fixed. But now, they've made them, we're so dependent on them that we move them around the planet, and, corn is literally found everywhere, and rice is, that's an interesting part too.
Yeah, the idea that plants have domesticated us.
Oh, right.
Yeah, absolutely. And another really interesting aspect of your work, and you phrased it so well in your presentation, is the idea of radical different scales.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could tell us more about what's important in your work in the context of these radical different scales. It seems like right now we're so much more interested in scales in this respect. There are different stories that can be told by considering different scales. And in this case, I think seeds encapsulate time frames that exceed sometimes our own lives. There's of course the idea of the visual and vision, and how the actual scale of their lives can also be productive in our case, in the case of seed banks, because there's a storage possibility. I'm thinking, they're not all as big as coconuts, which would probably make the storing in banks quite complicated. So there are all these factors of different scales playing into the seed banks, and then again in your work. How do you decide, for instance, to enlarge? To what scale do you enlarge seeds to make them visible?
Well, part of that is the limitations of the images, right? So I'm making, by using X-ray, right? There's part of it is scale, but part of it is also that you're actually getting to see inside of things.
Mm-hmm.
So and it's interesting to me the way that people respond to these tiny, tiny seeds when they're blown up. They're usually about 1 meter by 1 meter, the images are, the just individual seeds. But when you look at that changes what people think it might be, because sometimes they look like pictures of the stars or the sun or aquatic, like jellyfish. They shift in a way that their identity is really shifting to. And I think that notion of scale, of how we think about what it is and how the entity changes when you can see this enlarged thing that you might just see as a little black dot, and then it blows up and then you see all these really beautiful details to it, I think is really interesting, and allows again for that notion of the way that you feel small when you contemplate the universe, right? That it goes the other way, that there are these little tiny universes all around us that we don't really think about. But the other thing is, for me, is like the notion that we are trying to plan something that will last, is a time capsule, that we are going to have somebody, maintain for 200 years or more, that they could live without care for 200 years more is what they're trying to do. But with care, they're thinking they can extend the life even farther. And so that notion of kind of extending beyond our lifespans, which of course is not what, plants routinely live 200 years, right? So that notion of where we fit into that and our short-sightedness because of that, I think is really interesting. But, they've found seeds and pods that they, rice that's 2,000 years old that still germinates without any particular care. And they found a 35,000-year-old tuber that sprouted in the permafrost in Siberia. So that time scale of like the human world relationship is so interesting.
Oh yeah, it is. And listening to you right now, I'm also thinking about the sublime and how, you know, we've been talking about scales and we've been talking about this notion of life that resides in a kind of almost embryonic way, incubating for so long. And I'm wondering if there's also, in relation to your use of blue in your work, if there's also a spiritual connotation to your approach to seeds that you see, or even if it's not expressed in the work, is it something that you consider when you create your images?
Well, you know, I did name it Archiving Eden, right? So it has this kind of Christian biblical era. And I really wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking more about the metaphoric garden, right? The metaphoric original garden.
Yeah.
When I titled it. But yeah, it's often there is a spiritual quality that people recognize. And I think the kind of celestial blue has that, you know, people connect that in that way. But it's not the first thing on my mind. It's more about that spark of life, which I guess you could interpret as being that.
And you've been also briefly mentioning the importance of institutions and working with scientists, which I guess it's essential to your work. And, you know, on Antennae, just last year, we had 2 issues dedicated to art and science. I'm very close to communities of bioartists who work around the world. And we're all aware of the challenges, not just the productivities that can emerge from collaborations between artists and scientists. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the specific. You know, when we say also art and science, we're dealing with 2 enormous fields with many different personalities, depending on what type of art and what type of science we engage with. So I was wondering, in this specific case with seed banks, if you have encountered specific challenges or you know, even like methodology require the special kind of attention in order to address issues with terminology sometimes, or maybe even the mistrust that sometimes artists who work in a scientific context report that they were seeing as the outsider coming in without the scientific rigor.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I often I jokingly call this project 50 First Dates, because, you know, I show up with all this gear, right? Like, you know, tripod and now I have a digital stitching head so I can make these giant images, and I have to, and I'm going into these like super secure spaces and making pictures, right? Like within a day of meeting somebody, I am in their space making that image. And part of that is like establish trust really quickly. And for me, there's a few scientists where I've worked with them on an ongoing basis over the years to use their labs to do the X-ray machines. And yes, there's this totally different point of view. Usually, the first set of questions I had to overcome was like, there's nothing here that's of interest or worthy of your making images of. And I was like, well, just give me a chance. And so they kept saying yes. And, you know, and then I would go, well, look at you using this X-ray machine to make these statistical analyses. Do you mind if I use it? And then they would say yes. And so for me, I had, you know, the conversations were great. We didn't understand each other at all. And so finding a common language was a challenge, but it also kind of led to these kind of sparks where they hadn't really thought about doing, you know, X-raying tissue samples. So there would be excitement when they would say, oh, well, can you get that? You know, maybe do you think you could make an image of that? And I would say, well, let's just give that a try, right? So for me, I had a mostly positive experience because, you know, it's the kind of collaboration where I'm not having to get consensus on a decision. They are working it as if I was a visiting researcher working on my own project. So they're like toddlers side by side playing together, right? Where they allow me to use, and usually there's somebody to make sure that I'm not, a bull in the china shop breaking things. And then after a while, they're like, oh, she's perfectly fine. And then they let me go to make these images, but it's really just allowing me access and the opportunity to do it. And then, and then it's interesting to them because no one could be more surprised than they were when it ended up becoming, it was like an American Airlines magazine or something, and some senator saw it. And so that, it affected their funding. And what an interesting thing, this notion of like these beautiful images that someone said, talks about. It was just, I think there's maybe one documentary image, it was just the x-rays. And, then there's this positive feedback loop that gets established. And plus they're interested to see it because it celebrates their work, I think, and they work in isolation, as I said, or on these projects that take forever, so having somebody who's interested, I think, is positive. So I haven't found many negative experiences, right? Part of it is just, for me, the challenge has been fundraising for travel and, access, and that's really been the challenge but, once I get there, I've literally, I get off a plane sometimes without language capabilities, like in Cuban. I just get off the plane and I just trust that there's going to be a scientist there. And sure enough, there's a scientist there, picks me up and knows somebody I know, and, off we go. So it's been a very positive thing for me.
That's great to hear. I also wanted to ask you if you have, over this incredible journey through seed banks around the world, if you have become fond of a particular seed for whatever reason, one that really stands out to you.
I have, that's interesting. I am always interested in the seeds in front of me, right? Like, so when I'm working, it's like the most beautiful thing is the thing in front of me. But I'm really interested in the challenge of bananas because it ties into the history. Bananas are predicted to go extinct. They are battling a blight very similar to the potato blight. And they evidently, the Lord Cavendish banana that we're eating now, or that is in wide distribution. I don't know what they have in India, but I know in the US and on the Western Hemisphere, the most common banana that you encounter is the Lord Cavendish, and they think it's going to go extinct. There's a second banana. There was another banana that was better that went extinct, and then they replaced it with the Lord Cavendish. And in Brazil, I encountered I think will replace the Lord Cavendish, and it's very good. But the notion of like this fruit that doesn't produce many seeds, and the story about trying to find a way to get it to reproduce and finding the seeds and crossbreeding. I find that one, I'm very interested in that right now. I'm also interested in corn and potatoes because of my personal history.
It has indeed been a very enlightening conversation. Thank you, Dornith and Giovannai, for sharing your valuable perspectives with our audience. I'd like to remind our audience that the speakers will be present for a Q&A session just after this. So please leave your questions in the chat box and don't forget to join the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Giovannai. That was fun. Super fun. And
thank you.
Thanks to everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.